What if the very act of shedding the colonial past led a young, heroic nation to become a new, unexpected empire? This is the story of how America's pursuit of liberty gave way to the fatal allure of conquest. And it all revolves around a cluster of 7,000 breathtaking islands in the Pacific. We must confront the untold chapter of American history that reveals the nation's deepest contradiction. For over 30,000 years, people have been living and thriving in the Philippine archipelago. They established intricate maritime trade networks, cultivating a rich tapestry of culture, identity, and indigenous spiritual beliefs. Their communities were sophisticated, independent political units known as barangays, led by chieftains or datus, flourishing as part of a dynamic Asian trade world. But global history is a relentless march of colliding worlds. Across the globe, in Europe, a different trajectory of human evolution was underway. That culture, driven by the fervor of the age of exploration and a different religious mandate, often achieved its advancements through expansion, extraction, and domination. They viewed conquest not as a tragedy, but as a path to claim wealth and territory. The first to claim this archipelago were the Spanish, arriving in 1521, and over the next 4 centuries the islands were seized and renamed after the Spanish crown prince, who would later become King Philip II. The legacy of this 4th-century Spanish rule was profound. Manila became the crucial nexus of the Manila galleon trade, connecting Asia to the New World, and Catholicism fundamentally altered the social and spiritual landscape. But by the late 1800s, the mighty Spanish Empire was a crumbling relic, leaving only a few remaining territories: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. For the Filipinos, the final decades of this era were marked by intense nationalist fervor. Revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had mobilized an organized war for independence against Spain. By the time the world turned to the year 1898, Spanish forces were exhausted, contained, and on the verge of total defeat at the hands of their own colonial subjects. But here's the unexpected twist in this story. The final chapter of Spanish control was not written by the Filipinos, but by the arrival of a new superpower that had only just emerged from its own colonial shadow. In the United States, an aggressive ideology was gaining ground. While the sitting president, William McKinley, was initially hesitant about overseas adventures, his administration was filled with ambitious men who saw Spanish decline as a golden opportunity. Their immediate interest lay in the nearby Spanish colony of Cuba, where revolutionaries were fighting for independence. The sensationalist Yellow Press inflamed public opinion, pushing hard for intervention. The explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 provided the perfect pretext. Despite the likely cause being an internal accident, unethical journalism immediately and unequivocally blamed Spain. The war was on, but it had to be sold to the American people using a morally justifiable angle, and that angle was liberation. Yet, the true architect of the American Pacific Empire was not the president. It was Theodore Roosevelt, then only the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. A man of ferocious imperialist ideals, Roosevelt seized an opportunity while his superior was absent. He dispatched a direct secret cable to Commodore George Dewey, commander of the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, with a stunning preemptive mandate. Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands. Commence operations at once against the Spanish fleet. Just like that, the war, initially confined to the Caribbean, was expanded to the Pacific, including the seizure of Puerto Rico and Guam and the takeover of the Philippines. How could a minor official trigger a war that spanned 2 oceans? It was an audacious act of insubordination, but the military machine was now in motion. Commodore Dewey executed his orders flawlessly. On May 1, 1898, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron annihilated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without a single American death. The victory was swift and absolute. When the U.S. fleet arrived, they found that Filipino local forces, under the command of Emilio Aguinaldo, had already contained the Spanish for months. Aguinaldo was brought back to the Philippines by the Americans, and the Filipino revolutionaries genuinely believed the U.S. had come to help them achieve their long-sought independence. But the American government, fueled by commercial and strategic interests, had no intention of simply handing the islands over. The Philippines was viewed as an indispensable gateway to China and a vital naval base in the Pacific. They would take it. The Spanish, knowing their position was hopeless, wanted to avoid the final humiliation of surrendering to the Filipino forces. Spanish commanders secretly negotiated with their U.S. counterparts. In a stunning display of racial prejudice and colonial solidarity, Spanish commander Fermín Jodenes insisted he would only surrender to the Americans. The U.S. commander, seeing a chance for a clear-cut, decisive military victory, agreed to the deception. This ensured the U.S. would claim the territory by right of conquest, rather than as an ally to a successful revolution. The deceit culminated on August 13, 1898, with the execution of a choreographed and fake battle for Manila. The Spanish were under orders to offer only token resistance. Crucially, the Filipino fighters, who were poised and ready to take the city, were deliberately excluded from the final assault. The surrender was made directly and exclusively to the American forces. The climax of this theatrical event was not war, but a transaction. In December 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the Spanish-American War. Spain formally ceded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. In exchange for the islands, Spain received a payment of $20 million. Imagine the moment of realization. The Filipinos had fought and won their freedom, only to have their sovereignty bought and sold by their supposed allies in a distant European capital. The promised liberation became an undeniable betrayal. The U.S. government now had to sell its conquest to a nation founded on anti-colonial principles. They launched a massive propaganda campaign to justify the empire. This was the moment the term "the white man's burden" entered the public consciousness. The government and media framed the takeover not as theft, but as the honorable duty of the U.S. to civilize the Filipino people. The famous soap advertisement featuring Commander Dewey, urging Americans to brighten the dark corners of the earth, perfectly captured the racist and paternalistic narrative used to justify the new American empire. But the Filipino people refused to submit. Under Aguinaldo, they quickly pivoted from fighting Spain to fighting the United States. This ignited the brutal Philippine-American War, a devastating conflict from 1899 to 1902. The U.S. government desperately tried to downplay it, often calling it an insurrection, but it was a full-scale colonial war. The fighting was savage. U.S. troops employed tactics, including concentration zones and mass killing, that led to the death of as many as 200,000 to 250,000 Filipino civilians from violence, famine, and disease. It was a dark, bloody chapter, and one that has been carefully downplayed in American history books for decades. Why would the nation that launched a revolution over no taxation without representation impose a violent, costly war to deny the same rights to another people? The answer lies not just in conquest, but in the highest court of the land. The war's conclusion raised a fundamental legal question. Is this new land truly America? Are these people Americans? The question culminated in a series of landmark legal battles before the U.S. Supreme Court between 1901 and 1922, collectively known as the Insular cases. The core issue was this: did the U.S. Constitution automatically extend to the new territories? If it did, the inhabitants of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam would be granted full citizenship rights, including voting rights and free trade with the U.S. mainland, rights that would disrupt American economic interests and upend the prevailing racial order. The court's decision was a catastrophic constitutional compromise that formally codified the nation's status as an empire. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not follow the flag completely. They created a new, distinct legal category of land: unincorporated territories. In these territories, the people were not automatically entitled to all constitutional rights, and Congress had the unilateral authority to create specific laws for them, especially laws relating to revenue and commerce, like imposing tariffs. The court essentially declared these territories belong to, but are not a part of, the United States. This decision, steeped in the racist and colonial beliefs of the era, ensured that the inhabitants were permanently kept at arm's length, denied the full rights of American citizenship. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam were deemed to be lands controlled and exploited for American revenue and strategic advantage, but whose people were merely subjects. The consequence of this apathy became shockingly evident on December 7, 1941. When the Japanese fleet launched its massive attack, it bombed not only Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, but also the U.S. military installations in Guam and the Philippines. But notice what happened next. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous address to the nation, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. He deliberately minimized the attacks on the colonial territories. Roosevelt's original draft, which mentioned Manila, was crossed out. The Supreme Court had already declared that these people were not fully American, so their suffering was deemed peripheral to the main American narrative. Following the bombing, Japan fully invaded the Philippines and occupied it for years. The Philippines was finally granted independence in 1946. However, the legal precedent set by the Insular cases still applies to millions of people living in the remaining unincorporated territories: Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. In stark reality, these territories function as 21st-century constitutional anachronisms. The people who live here do not enjoy full democratic rights. They cannot vote for the president and have no voting representation in Congress. The inadequate federal response to major crises, such as the devastation following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, is a direct, modern echo of the Supreme Court's century-old decision. These territories are perpetually the other, to be governed by Congress for its own purposes, but never to be fully embraced as part of the American Union. This is a history of betrayal, legal exclusion, and a national contradiction that still demands reckoning today. This story is a powerful reminder that history is often far more complex and often more uncomfortable than the simplified versions we are taught. We use dynamic, animated visuals to make this critical history accessible and engaging, relying on research compiled from respected historians and academic sources, with references clearly displayed on screen. If this analysis of power, empire, and constitutional contradiction has deepened your understanding, please like this video, comment with your thoughts on how this history affects us today, and share it to spark a vital conversation. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell to catch our next deep dive into a history that continues to shape our world.